Today I'm picking up on a series of messages that I started some time back on Matthew's Gospel. Really, it's an account of the life and the ministry of Jesus. And so as we pick that up today, I want to look at chapters 8 and 9 together. If we could summarize these two chapters with using just a couple of words, it would probably be Jesus' authority and his power. We see Jesus here performing miracles, miracles of healing, where he heals the blind, heals the lame, the paralyzed, even raises someone from the dead. But we also see Jesus exercising authority. He shows that he has authority over nature, as he tells the storm to calm down when they're on the boat, over the spiritual world as he commands demons. It even says that he has authority to forgive sins, as he tells someone that his sins are forgiven. But as much as we see Jesus' power and authority, we also see Jesus' compassion. His compassion on the woman that was bleeding for 12 years, that came up and touched the corner of his robe. The compassion that Jesus had as he saw the man with leprosy, and instead of just saying be healed, actually touched him. Jesus didn't only perform miracles to prove who he was. He didn't only perform miracles to show his power. He also performed miracles and healed people because he genuinely cared and loved them. He actually cares about your well-being and my well-being as well. What we're going through matters to Jesus. What we're going through matters to God. When we're hurt or afraid, when we're uncertain, when we're going through times of difficulty or danger, God cares and he's there. And he's willing and able to help. I think it's a great reminder for us right now that in this time that we're going through, as we wrestle through this time of uncertainty and as we resist the temptation to give way to fear, we need a reminder that God is here. And that God is not only here, he cares and he's able to help. Jesus, being fully God himself, shows us the power and the authority of God. And it's as true today as it was in the time when Jesus was walking the earth, when he brought healing to people. So with that in our minds, let's look a little bit more closely at chapters 8 and 9 of Matthew. In the first section, in chapter 8, verses 1 to 13, we see two stories of great faith. I'm going to read that passage. Large crowds of people followed Jesus as he came down the mountainside. Suddenly a man with leprosy approached him, and he knelt before him. Lord, the man said, if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean. Jesus reached out and touched him. I am willing, he said. Be healed. And instantly the leprosy disappeared. Then Jesus said to him, don't tell anyone about this. Instead, go to the priest and let him examine you. Take along the offering required in the law of Moses for those who have been healed of leprosy. This will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed. When Jesus returned to Capernaum, a Roman officer came and pleaded with him, Lord, my young servant lies in bed, paralyzed and in terrible pain. Jesus said, I will come and heal him. But the officer said, Lord, I'm not worthy to have you come into my home. Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. I know this, because I am under the authority of my superior officers, and I have authority over my soldiers. I only need to say, go, and they go, or come, and they come. And if I say to my slaves, do this, they do it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. Turning to those who were following him, he said, I tell you the truth. I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel. And I tell you this, that many Gentiles will come from all over the world, from east and west, and sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob at the feast in the kingdom of heaven. But many Israelites, those for whom the kingdom was prepared, will be thrown into outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the Roman officer, go back home. Because you believed, it has happened. And the young servant was healed at that same hour. So the first story that we see is a story of a man with the disease leprosy. And at that time, it was believed that leprosy was incurable and that was also highly contagious. And so people with leprosy, they were literally outcasts of society. If they lived in a city or a town or a village, they were forced to leave and live on the outside of those villages, set up little camps outside, away from family, away from friends, away from the faith community. When they did have to come back into the city or the town, they were often forced to ring a bell and to yell in a loud voice, "Unclean," so that people had time to scurry away from them. Their disease was often seen as a punishment from God for some kind of sin. They were literally rejected in every way. No one ever touched a leper, partly because of the fear of catching the disease, but partly because oftentimes they became so grotesque and deformed that they were hard to look at, let alone even think about touching. Yet when this unclean, rejected, outcast leper sees Jesus coming his way with a large group of people around him, he approaches him. He comes up to him. Listen to his words again. "Lord, if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean." Notice what he didn't say. It wasn't a question. It wasn't, "Lord, can you make me clean? Can you heal me?" Notice that also the only thing that was in question in his statement was Jesus' willingness. He did not doubt or question Jesus' ability, his power to do it. Instead, the man kneels down and submits himself to the compassion of Jesus, his willingness to help. That's great faith. He believed that Jesus could do it. He just asked if Jesus was willing to do it for him. How often do we face situations that we think are impossible and we're tempted to say, there's no hope in this scenario. There's no hope in this situation. It's an impossible thing to look at. And from the world's point of view, it probably is. From the world's point of view, for this leper, this man with leprosy, certainly the worldly view was that it was impossible to cure, that he would spend his whole life in a growing state of disease and getting worse and separated from his family, separated from friends. Now, leprosy can be cured today because there is medicine for it, but not back then. It was impossible. It was hopeless. And yet, in that hopeless and impossible situation, this man has the incredible faith to come to Jesus and say, "If you're willing, you can heal me." And when he puts his impossible situation into Jesus' hands and surrenders to Jesus, what happens? Well, three things in the passage that we see. First, Jesus touches the man. When was the last time this man had been touched? We have no idea. We don't know his backstory, but probably a long time. Since the moment he was discovered to have this disease, no one ever touched him. No one ever came even close to him. The basic human need for physical contact had been denied him since that point in his life. This is the compassion of Jesus here. Jesus sees beyond the man's need just for physical healing. He sees deeper into his need. It's an even greater need. The man's need to be loved. The man's need to be touched. Second, Jesus speaks to the man and says, "I am willing." Jesus confirms to the man his willingness, his compassion and goodness to heal him. And then third, he heals the man, removes the disease from him, restores him, confirms to him the man's faith, that his faith in Jesus is well placed, that Jesus is in fact powerful enough to heal him. Then there's another story of great faith that we see a little further on in chapter 9, verses 18 to 22. Matthew chapter 9, verses 18 to 22. As Jesus was saying this, the leader of the synagogue came and knelt before him. "My daughter just died," he said, "but you can bring her back to life again if you just come and lay your hand on her." So Jesus and his disciples got up and went with him. Just then, a woman who had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding came up behind him. She touched the fringe of his robe, for she thought, "If I can just touch his robe, I'll be healed." Jesus turned around, and when he saw her, he said, "Daughter, be encouraged. Your faith has made you well." And the woman was healed at that moment. She believed that Jesus had the power to heal her, and she acted on that belief. Jesus senses it. Somehow, we don't know how, but turns to her and calls her daughter. Passion. Not only does Jesus not rebuke her for kind of sneaking up behind him and trying to touch his robe to get what she needed, he actually affirms her. He says, be encouraged. Some translations say, take heart. Your faith has healed you. Compassion. And then, of course, she was healed. She received that healing that she was so desperate for. Power. For you and I, our prayers aren't always answered in the way that we want. But when they're not answered the way that we want, we can know that know and be assured that it's not because God is not powerful enough, and it's not because God is not good enough. In the second story, we see that that was a story of great faith. We see that it wasn't even, a Jewish person who had the great faith. It was a Gentile Roman centurion, a military man. He also comes to Jesus, but in his situation, it wasn't for himself. It was for a young servant that he had, and out of his care for his servant being ill and paralyzed and in great pain, he comes to Jesus. This man's care for his servant, just by itself, is notable and tells us something about his character. But he also comes with this incredible faith in Jesus, knowing that Jesus can do something about it. His faith is so great that he doesn't even need Jesus to come with him to his house to do it. He believes that Jesus can take care of it right then and right there, just by saying the word. His faith comes out of an understanding of authority. As a military person, he understood authority. He had people that were over him in authority, and he had to answer to them, and he had people who were under him in authority. And so when he said to do something to them, he knew they did it. He didn't have to follow along after them, make sure. He understood authority, and he believed that Jesus had the authority. Not only did he believe that Jesus had the power to do it, but he believed that Jesus had the authority just to say the word and that it would be done. And in verse 13 of chapter 8, we see that Jesus says the word and assures the man that when he goes home, he'll find his servant healed. And sure enough, the man did go home. And according to his reports, at the very hour that Jesus had said that word, the servant was healed. Let's not miss the words in between there, though, verses 10 to 12, where Jesus foreshadows the Gentiles, those who are not of Jewish background, being added into the kingdom of God. For many of the Jewish people, this would have been a new idea, and for many, I think especially the Jewish religious leaders, this would have been an unwelcome idea. The idea that Gentiles, those who had not been chosen, would be welcomed into the kingdom of God, and that there would be Israelites who would miss it. Not a popular idea. Jesus' words here were a commendation of the Roman centurion's incredible faith. But notice, as you look more closely, who Jesus says those words to in verses 10 to 12. He didn't say it to the Gentile. He didn't say it to the Roman soldier. He said it to the Jewish people who were around him. It was a warning to those Jewish people not to miss the new thing that Jesus was doing. This is a continuation of the theme that I highlighted earlier in this series. That as Jesus comes and as Jesus begins to preach and teach and minister to the people, he's showing the need for a new kind of righteousness, a new kind of faithfulness. Jesus in the early going said that if your righteousness does not surpass that of the Pharisees and the teacher of the law, you don't even have a chance of getting into the kingdom of God. That was a radical idea for the people. Because the kind of righteousness that they were about was an external kind of righteousness. It was a righteousness of doing things, of external, of outside things. That Roman centurion, in all likelihood, wasn't following the ways of the Jewish teachings. And so he hadn't done all the right things. He wasn't following all the right traditions and the right practices. And so he wouldn't have been considered a righteous person, a person of faith. And yet when Jesus interacts with him, he says, I've not seen such great faith in all of Israel. All he did was believe Jesus. All he did was put his trust and his faith in him. And that was considered great faith. That was new. We see this theme come again later on in chapter 9, verses 9 to 17. I'm not going to take time to read those words right now, but we see two stories, again, about this new thing that Jesus is doing. In the first story, Matthew is telling his own story about how he came to faith in Jesus. Jesus calls Matthew, a tax collector and a sinner, calls him to be his disciple. And then Jesus goes to Matthew's house and has dinner at Matthew's house with all of Matthew's other tax collector and sinner friends. And the religious people start to criticize Jesus for it, but Jesus points them to a passage from the Old Testament prophet Hosea. We find it in Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, where it says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Jesus then follows it up by saying, I haven't come to those who think that they're righteous, but to those who think that they're sinners. I'm sure that didn't win Jesus any points either with the religious leaders. Then in the second story, he's questioned about fasting. Why don't his disciples fast, observe certain kinds of fasts, in the same way that John's disciples did and the Pharisees did? And in answer to that question, Jesus gives three pictures of the new thing he was doing. The first is a picture of his disciples as wedding guests, celebrating instead of attendees of a funeral who were in mourning. The second one was sewing a new unshrunken patch of cloth on an old, already shrunken piece of clothing that had a hole in it. And the third was the idea of putting new wine into new wineskins, or new wine into old wineskins. In all three of these pictures, the lesson is the same. But let me explain that last picture a little bit, in case you're not familiar. When the people in Jesus' day and in ancient times made wine, they would often put the new wine that was still in the fermentation process in wineskins, in containers of animal hide. And as that new wine fermented, if you're familiar with the fermentation process, certain gases are released, carbon dioxide and that sort of thing, and it will actually expand, and that gas needs to have room to go to be expanded. And so a new wineskin that was made of new animal skin had the ability to be flexible and to stretch and to accommodate that extra expansion of the gases. But that skin had its limit. If you tried to use that same skin a second time, it would have reached that limit already. And so when the gases began to expand, it would burst and the skin would be ruined and unusable for anything else. The wine would all fall out on the ground. Both were lost. And Jesus' lesson here is that with his new internal, heart-focused thing that Jesus was doing, that those old external ritualistic kinds of things aren't going to work anymore. They're not going to do the job that we need them to do anymore. They may have once, but they don't now. And as Jesus said back in chapter 8, verses 11 to 12, he says, many of the Jews would miss this. They would miss this new thing that God was doing. They would miss their place in the kingdom of heaven because of it. I think this might relate to us today, too, to some extent. In these unprecedented times that we're living in, what new thing is God inviting us into? In these days where church for many people is simply that you go someplace for an hour or two on Sunday morning and that's about it. What happens when you can't do that? What happens when we can't come to a building and meet face to face? For us right now, what new thing is God doing? What new thing is God inviting us to be as his church in this time of crisis? And will we miss it or will we catch it? Are we listening for this new thing and looking for this new thing that God is doing, that he's inviting us into? Or are we just kind of hunkering ourselves down, waiting for this crisis to be over so we can go back to the old ways? Let's remember that God is calling us to be a church that's not about the external things. It's not about those external things. It's about the internal things. It's about what's going on in our hearts. I think that we're learning, but we have much more to learn yet about what church really is. It isn't about Sunday. Church isn't about programs. It isn't about committee meetings. It isn't even about buildings, although it's nice and comfortable to have a building to meet in. I think right now, because of this situation that we're in, people are looking for hope and for comfort and for meaning in ways that they have maybe never looked for it before. In these times of uncertainty, people are looking for answers. And we may not have the answers ourselves, but we know the one who does. We can put our trust and our faith in Jesus, the one who does have the answers. As people seek answers and they seek comfort, they're not going to receive it from a church service. They can only get it from God. And as we, as the church, live it out and share it with them. What new wineskins is God inviting us to use? What new structures, new relationships is God wanting to use to bring hope to a world that needs it? New hope and new peace to people in this time. As you and I, as the church, exercise faith in God through this time, trusting in His power, in His authority, and His compassion, we need to lend that faith to other people. We need to share it with those around us who are looking for it as well. God, help us not to miss this new thing that you're doing right now.